Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. The time is now 4 o'clock, and it's my privilege to hand over the screen to two presenters, Justin Hansen and Sierra Palmer, who are going to discuss the privilege to be free from addiction, how LGBTQI plus and African Americans are being targeted by big tobacco. Thank you so much, Justin and Sierra. Have a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and thank you for the introduction. So before we get started, audience members, I know we had a discussion panel for the last session. So first I'm going to do what our team at Youth Encouraging Alaskans Health calls an engagement point. So right now on the screen, I have my title, which is the privilege to be free from addiction. I'd like you guys all to write one word that you guys think of when you think of addiction. And guys, we'll give you 30 seconds for that. Sierra, if you would read those chats as they're coming in.
Yeah. Illness, drugs, commonplace, substances, ongoing, trapped, trauma, abuse,
Okay, Sierra, I think that is our 30 seconds. So thank you so much for that. So guys, today I would like to talk about my title slide here first, and we will go into the rest of the presentation in a second, but the privilege to be free from addiction. So privilege normally comes with quite a different array of things when you're thinking about it. It can be the freedom to be able to express yourself out loud or out in public. It could be the freedom to be able to vote or to marry who you would like to. And all of those things are privileges for us as Americans and for us as certain parts of groups. Now, this privilege also goes in a different way, and that is the privilege to be free from addiction. During this presentation, we are going to talk about how African Americans first were targeted and how LGBTQIA+ people are now being targeted in the exact same way, so that they are being addicted to harmful tobacco substances. Sierra, I will get to the next slide.
So we're going to go over a few things today. We'll introduce ourselves, who we are, and what organizations we are representing. We'll start out with tobacco use with plus communities. We'll move on to tobacco use within Black communities and communities of color, the targeted ad history of tobacco companies and what we want to do about it and what interventions exist and what should be implemented.
All right, Sierra, and if you could go first on the introduction.
Yeah, so I'm Sierra Palmer. I'm a current Master's of Public Health student at Boston University School of Public Health. And I'm also an intern with the National LGBT Cancer Network, which is based out of Rhode Island. And I'm excited to be in this presentation with all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Sierra. So a little bit about me is Justin Hansen. I work for two different organizations, the Youth Encouraging Alaskans Health and the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. In both of those, I am a youth ambassador or a teen ambassador, and I go to legislatures. I talk about bills regarding tobacco. I also talk about legislation at the same time that may not become bill yet. I went and taught elementary, middle school, and high school students lessons on tobacco. And I'm a full-blown Alaskan. I've been here my entire life. I've stayed here, and this is a photo of me on the Kenai River with a salmon. Okay, Sierra.
So as I said, we'll begin with tobacco use and smoking within the LGBTQI+ communities. Throughout the presentation, I might change the acronym a little bit based on what the research and the data are saying. So if I just say LGB, it means that transgender individuals were not included in the research or the data. And I may interchange just the queer community or the community, but just know that I am encompassing the entire LGBTQ+ community.
Thank you, Sierra.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the next slide we go. So this is, again, your slide looks like on the presentation, and I will interject in when we need those in our break.
So tobacco use and smoking rates have actually regulations. However, for the LGBT and LGB communities, it's actually on the rise, and the Black communities as well. So smoking rates are actually 50% higher in queer communities when compared to non-queer communities. Rates of vaping are also much higher, especially in the youth. And smoking habits directly, a newer study actually came out saying that changing sexual identities, which often happens when you're in your youth, has been correlated to higher rates of vaping as well as cigarette smoking. So during adolescence, when we might be going through those sexual identity changes, a lot of teens are actually working to fit into new peer groups, and sometimes to fit in, they may begin these habits. And individuals within the community do not necessarily view tobacco as their #1 health issue, but epidemiologically, it is the #1 health issue for this community. And in a few slides, we'll go over some targeted ads that tobacco companies have used specifically aimed at LGBT communities. And it's definitely worth noting that most smokers began using tobacco before the age of 18.
Okay, and Sierra, thank you for introducing that topic with marketing. As we can see on this slide, this is just a couple examples of, I believe, magazine clippings and magazine pages that have been marketed to the LGBTQ plus community. We have 2 of them encouraging both pride and just the idea of choice, which in our community today, just a few years back, those were really rejected by a large part of the United States population. But now that is becoming more integrated, that problem is becoming worse. But the heyday of that time, when those rights were not given for marriage, this was a very provocative marketing and got a lot of LGBTQIA plus people targeted and hooked on tobacco products.
Is also a big concern for transgender communities. Transgender individuals are at an additional risk of tobacco use and negative health outcomes associated with that. So in the US transgender survey done in 2015, 36.8% were currently smoking. Their smoking rates are 50% higher than the general population. And nicotine use often correlates with other life stressors, which transgender individuals can experience at higher rates as well, such as low income, sex work, not passing. And then additionally, transgender people have 3.5 times higher the odds of past 30-day cigar use. And one additional health outcome is also that many transgender individuals are on hormone replacement therapies, and combining that with smoking and tobacco products can place them at an increased risk for things such as blood clots, which can potentially be life-threatening.
All right, and I do want to point out what you said about the other life stressors. At Youth Encouraging Alaskans Health, we talk about coping mechanisms, unhealthy and healthy coping mechanisms. With those, one of our biggest things is against vaping for youth, because that is a really unhealthy coping mechanism. However, it tends to be where that is actually being more popular to the youth, and we'll discuss that later in our slides. Or right now. Sierra?
Okay, so youth vaping is of particular concern, and the population assessment of tobacco health, also known as the PATH study, collected data between 2014 and 2016, and then analyzed the data in 2019. So in the study, there was 8,661 adolescents, and which is a pretty big sample size for a longitudinal study. And the study objective was to investigate whether the prospective association between electronic cigarette use and cigarette smoking is dependent on smoking intention status, Previous data shows that there are 2 major pathways from e-cigarettes to cigarette smoking. One is the smoking intention, or the addiction pathway. So the addiction pathway is e-cigarettes, as we know, deliver high concentrations of nicotine and creating the nicotine addiction. And the smoking intention pathway was mainly a lack of firm commitment to not begin smoking. So the conclusions of this study were that e-cigarette use is associated with increased odds of cigarette smoking among adolescents who had no previous smoking intention. And e-cigarette users were 4 times more likely than never e-cigarette users to have smoked cigarettes at the time of follow-up. So I think this study is really pretty pretty informative of the rates that e-cigarettes are causing a higher rate of later on cigarette smoking.
Yep, and as I talked about, we do at Youth Encouraging Health, Alaskans Health, talk a lot about this issue. And quite a long time ago, the CDC actually called vaping among teenagers and other youth an epidemic. It was so serious at this time that legislation has been introduced in the House of Representatives, which we'll talk about later, that would start banning menthol flavors and all of the flavors of e-cigarettes, and maybe even some of just flavored cigarettes in general. And Sierra, can you speak to the transgender portion of our bullet points?
Yeah, so transgender individuals have 5 times higher odds of past 30-day e-cigarette use compared to cisgender people. So they are more likely to begin vaping, switch to cigarette smoking, and as I said earlier, they have some unique health concerns in relation to the different types of therapies that they may be on. So it's just very high within this population.
Yep, and we talked a little bit earlier about vaping, just a slight bit. When we're talking here with vaping, when we start in the youth, even with cisgendered people and people of LGBT plus identification, there is something where it happens where they will actually start vaping and they will actually get dual use, where they will both smoke and vape interchangeably. And that really also will go against the idea that vaping can actually help smokers quit, which we'll talk about in this slide here. This is a slide on a different epidemic that we're seeing in the LGBTQ plus community about how this is actually becoming more and more popular in the volume that young people are actually watching. So here, I'm going to play the video.
Right before we start that, I'm going to give you a tiny little stat in relation. So this is from the Truth Campaign, and LGBT people are more than twice as likely to have been exposed to e-cigarette content than non-LGBT people on social media, such as Facebook, YouTube, and this video will go over more about on Netflix and the other types of media that we're consuming.
Okay. Sierra, we seem to have a problem. I'm going to try going in and out, and we'll see if that works.
Yeah, we might have to pull it up in a web page. Sometimes videos do this on Zoom. We can also play it at the end if it won't come up.
Okay, Sierra, I'm going to stop sharing screen and see if you can pull it up on your end, if that would be okay.
Sure.
While she's doing that, I will read a little bit through the chats that we've seen regarding with what addiction means. We didn't get through all of them, but I really liked the idea that Carol put out with powerless, because we'll see throughout this presentation that powerless, while it's not 100% something, there is power for people to have this addiction, and there's people to go through and find support networks. But there's also this idea that a lot of people were powerless to stop the tobacco industries in their extreme marketing to both LGBTQ plus and African American communities. And I do like the idea of ongoing. This didn't stop, it's still an ongoing process, and that it's extending through the future. So here, how are we doing on that video?
It actually looks like a problem from YouTube. So I will, and we might be able to play it at the end, but it seems like it's an issue with the YouTube hosting site, actually.
All right, cool. I will start sharing screen again then. Okay. All right, here we are again. Okay. And here is our next slide. We kind of skipped through there. Okay. And there we go. All right, so that kind of concludes our LGBT section. Right now, I'm actually ask for questions right now regarding the LGBTQ section, just some brief ones if you guys all, because we are running very slowly on our time than we anticipated. So if you guys would be able to put questions on the chat about that section, please go ahead. And Sierra, I will need your help on this as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump to the Truth Campaign's website and see if I can pull up that video there. Okay. But we can kind of start off with a little bit of a discussion topic. If anyone wants to share, if maybe they have had an impact of tobacco within themselves or within their community, or if they've noticed anything with any LGBTQ plus spaces, such as different kinds of campaigns or targeted ads or anything like that.
Recently quit smoking. This is Tisa Becker. I used the Alaska Tobacco Quit Hotline to help me. They sent me patches and stuff, but yeah, I actually did not start. I smoked I smoked when I was 19 years old, and then I did not smoke for like 20 something years, and I took it up in my 40s, just with some stress and stuff. But I don't know. I'm really thankful for that program because it was free and it just helped me to try new things. I didn't really like the gum, but I don't know, the patch fell out. I pretty much just did it with the counseling, but it was cool. It provided a lot of free resources and I recommend it to anyone who's struggling. And I did try vaping. I thought it might be healthier or something, but I don't know. I
That's
think
a
they
common
put too much.
perception.
Yeah, I think they put too much tobacco in that Juul. There's like two kinds of common vapes you can get.
Mhm.
And the Juul one has so much tobacco in it. I've only used it a couple times. It gave me a headache.
Yeah, I think the Juul, I forget how much nicotine they have in them, but they are very, very concentrated and super addictive. And I'm not really sure how they get away with that much nicotine in the Juul specifically. But congratulations on quitting. I'm really proud of you. And that is not easy. I myself am a former smoker. I started when I was in my teens and I thankfully only smoked for a year or so. But it was pretty difficult to quit. So I definitely congratulate you on that feat.
Yeah, it was like so hard with coffee too in the morning, but I also quit drinking coffee too. So it helps.
Can I say something? I don't smoke. I was born with a respiratory problem. I tried with my brothers and sisters. We stole somebody's cigarettes because it looked so cool, and we went out behind the washroom and started smoking. We're all choking and gagging. And we go, oh my God, this is horrible. Oh, how can anybody like this? I'm not going to spend my yard work money on this. So, and a young man was begging me for a lighter so he could light up because he looked like he was having the shakes. I go, come on, kid. I said, kick that habit in the butt and get rid of it. Take care of your young, healthy body while you can. I watched two people I cared very much for die of smoker's emphysema. Please don't do that to yourself. So, anyway, he thanked me for my care.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It is surprising now that you know, I am not a smoker anymore. Even just the smell of it really triggers me, and I don't like being around it. So I'm glad that you did not develop the taste for it.
All right, so Sierra, I was beforehand, so we can actually summarize that video quite easily since it is quite a short video. So remind me on it starting, what we have there is we have these situations where it shows these older ads from the 50s that people think have gone away, like the Flintstones tobacco and the magazines and all that things in the popular culture that people have just forgot have gone away. But it actually shows that streaming and Netflix and all of the shows on there, I think it's A Man in a High Castle it's even on, all of these different shows that are going to streaming and that are affecting young audiences are actually now coming into the woodwork and showing smoking.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers on there, but there was shows such as Stranger Things, Big Mouth. There was some that were from HBO that I haven't seen personally, but they stated that the imagery of vaping and cigarette smoking has actually increased and was shown on the screen quite significantly. And I think especially during the time of COVID, you know, a lot of us are at home and we're watching way more Netflix than we would probably like to publicly admit. And the fact that teenagers are binge watching these shows, they're really popular, and there's just this imagery that we've kind of taken a step back on banning that from popular shows, and seeing that imagery so often, especially for youth, can really impact the chances of them picking up smoking or any other type of tobacco product later on in life. So I think it's really something that we need to be looking at and editing these shows to really cut back on the imagery.
Yep, and our kind of co-presenter, kind of co-helper, Michelle is actually putting helpful tips in the chat. If you guys want to take a look at those, they are in there. She'll just keep updating us on different facts, different little tidbits that we can have right there. Sierra, do you think we want to start the African American section?
Yeah, and Michelle is actually, she works for the Cancer Network that I intern for, so she's my supervisor there. So she is definitely a wealth of knowledge, especially when it comes to LGBTQ, smoking, and health outcomes. Yeah, let's start on the next section.
All right, so what I want to talk about is basically how smoking became part of the African American community. This story is actually quite long, but it's very, very entertaining. It's an interesting thing, and it goes on 3 points: infiltration, utilization, and ending in addiction. So first, let's start with infiltration. So this really started way back in like the 1930s. This was a time where there was no voting rights for African Americans. Segregation was the law of the land in the South. And a lot of this historical just non-acceptance, not accepting that the Black person had an identity in any white person's life was going on. So Philip Morris, he was the trailblazer of this. He was the man, if you'll remember from the conference, who actually admitted to Congress how he spread disinformation to the American people on smoking, how he called it harmless, and how they knew that it wasn't harmless, right? But this, back if we go to the history of this, around the 1940s, 1930s, right, there was this idea that factories were segregated and that white people didn't hire Black salesmen. That was the white man's job. Now, Philip Morris saw this, and whether it was out of equality at that time or whether it was out of furthering his pockets and furthering his profit margin, he actually was the first person to hire a Black salesman. This kind of started a snowball effect, okay? From here, we had R.J. Reynolds and other tobacco companies kind of hiring people, desegregating their factories. But then, even after this, after all of this equality was going together, the true motive was really shown, right? They started actually advertising in Black publications, publications where these things had never been before, where these advertisements were not there at all. But now that we have these desegregated factories, they're getting into the Black identity. Now we go where it's even worse, okay? In the 1950s, we have the top executives in this company of Philip Morris actually infiltrating the National Urban League, which actually advocated for the rights to vote of Black Americans. So not only do we now have desegregated factories, this idea that the tobacco companies are some sort of progressive industry, but they also have seats on the table. So now that they have those seats on the table, that they have this idea in the culture, they start using that idea in the culture. Right? We have this guy, it's Heisman, the H didn't come through, and he is one of the people on that board. What Heisman ends up doing is he ends up seeing all the people on the board, he sees how they act, what they go with, how they operate, and he tries and actually implements that into how the tobacco brand is branded to African Americans, taking this infiltration they had and replicating this idea further and further out, making people slowly starting to get addicted. But they didn't just start after they had a seat at the National Urban League. What they did after that is Philip Morris and other companies started hiring past NAACP members, people who maybe had become disillusioned or maybe had just left the organization after voting rights were granted. This might be the 1960s, 1970s. These people were just being hired. So now, once we have these people, we have members on the board, we have all these Black Americans, we start to see a huge plethora, a giant amount of ads in magazines, online TV, and all this. And just because voting rights were granted to the African American community doesn't mean that they became accepted. It took a lot of years and is still taking years to actually have acceptance of African Americans in this country by groups. So, one thing that happened while all of this was going about, while all of these things were going on, was the idea of menthol. Now, the reason why they put menthol in cigarettes was so that it would be smoother when it went down. But this was kind of a relatively newish thing. Menthol wasn't always in cigarettes when we're talking about the 1930s. But we do have a new demographic now. We have African Americans. That's what the tobacco thinkers were seeing. They were saying, hey, we've got this new demographic, we've got a new product. And they said, well, it's easier to start, harder to quit because tobacco all the same. So they start, so Cool and all of those menthol companies are actually marketing through publications to these African Americans. And it has become ingrained in pop culture now that African Americans smoke menthols. And that is really what led to what I call the addiction stage. Now we have everyone in the African American community that was able to buy into this lie that the tobacco companies had sold them, that smoking and tobacco was part of the industry, was part of their culture. We have these people smoking menthols, right? Right now, menthol use is a really intense issue for Black youth, right? Middle schoolers and high schoolers are at a much, much higher risk of using menthols than they are normal cigarettes, which they could quit slightly easier than menthols. 9 in 10 African American smokers ages 12 and older use menthol cigarettes. That's from the Truth Initiative. So we see that now we have this addiction going on, okay? And what I wanted to do is I wanted to draw this conclusion. We see this past, we see how people have infiltrated this community, how they were able to exploit it for their own gain. But is that the same thing that's happening now with LGBTQ plus people? Are we seeing that infiltration, that normalization, all of those things that are coming about that we talked about earlier? Well, it seems like it. We know that both of those groups were fighting for acceptance and civil rights. We both know that they were looking, that they were saying, where in the world can we get acceptance? Where can we go that we can see our own image being portrayed in the media? And where did they see it? They saw it in magazines, publications, and tobacco-sponsored mediums. We have that with concerts now. We have that with Facebook images. I don't believe one of them was able to get put on our slide deck, but I would have done that if we didn't have problems today with our network connection. Now, really one of the things that we're seeing also in this is the idea of a product that's easier to start and harder to stop. With menthol cigarettes, it was just the menthol that would make it easier when a person was smoking. But with vaping, we see a different thing. With vaping, it's that extremely high nicotine content that our audience member talked about. It's that really, really large hit of nicotine that people can get, and also the accessibility of flavors. That's something way completely different with this. It's not just menthol, it's also mint and berry and all of those flavors that the FDA has power over to ban, that they could ban at any second of any minute of any day once they look into that study and see what's going on. But they've focused not to do so. So we also discussed about normalization, how once they started infiltrating into this area of being sponsored by rights organizations, as being just seen in magazines, seen in media, that there was this idea that it was normal to smoke, that killing yourself partially with nicotine or with the chemicals in vapes was something that was just normal. It's what everybody else did. That's happening now, as we would have saw in the video if that would have been able to play. Stranger Things, all of those ones that actually include transgender people and people of the LGBTQ plus community are actually shown on medias smoking, vaping, and using cigarette products and tobacco products much more than cisgender people. So with all these three things, we can see that this trend that happened back in the 1930s to the 1970s to the 2000s, when all of this was happening now, we see that it's coming up at the forefront again. So I think this raises one really big question. how do we stop it? How do we make this not happen again? Sierra, I think you've got the answer.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say the true answer, but some interventions that have been really proven effective are policies. So increases on taxes on tobacco products, with a little bit of a caveat that this does impact already marginalized communities a little bit more, impoverished people. And, you know, it's hard because taxing things do make them less accessible. But unfortunately, this does impact people who things are already inaccessible to them. So it kind of forces people to quit, which as a public health person is like a win, but also we need to think about that impact on these marginalized communities. Some other policies that are really effective are, as Justin mentioned, eliminating all flavors, including menthol. So there have been a lot of bans that have gone through on flavors, but they've been mostly focused on things like chocolate, strawberry, grape, in the form of those little cigars or different smoking things, not necessarily in the vape world. But menthol has been consistently left out of these bans. And as Justin mentioned, menthol is so deeply ingrained in Black communities and also in youth and LGBTQ communities as well. And then additionally, restricting targeted ads to vulnerable populations. So a big place for targeted ads is in sponsorship. Big Tobacco often sponsors pride festivals, bars, they do giveaways, they have vouchers for coupons to make cigarettes more affordable. So placing more restrictions on these ads to decrease purchasing and initiation as well.
Yeah, like Sierra said, sometimes when we have these huge problems in these communities, we have to actually have huge actions. A lot of people from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and Youth Encouraging Alaskans Health have actually supported ending the sale of flavored tobacco products, including menthols, in both the vaping and the tobacco world. I think this is something that really needs to be taken up by just the seriousness of this issue. It's just so large that we can't go to a point where we can just start, you know, making these things harder and harder to get. There might even need to be a ban. But one of the things, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention, and it's not necessarily solely on policymakers and governmental officials. As a community member, you have some control over these ads as well. If you have a gas station in your area that their front door is plastered in cigarette and alcohol advertisements, you can actually start to ask these businesses to decrease their marketing. It is a community thing, and if enough people come together, they can actually make changes in these marketings.
Yeah, and like our audience member talked before on how they had to go about quitting cigarettes and quitting tobacco because they started smoking, those cessation treatments are proven to work. And I think increasing the amount of spending those have on actual being able to fund them through different programs is very, very important. Medicaid and Medicare should have those things with them so that if they have that will to quit, they should be able to do. And Sierra, I believe there's a act that is in the House of Representatives, correct me not if it is correct here, reversing the Youth Tobacco Epidemic Act was released in the House of Representatives. They passed it there, and it's held up at the Senate at this point. It's going to be talking about banning e-cigarettes and menthol, or yeah, talking about banning e-cigarettes and menthol flavors, and maybe even flavored cigars.
There's a lot of different legislation going on. I don't know the specifics of that particular bill. I know that there's been some hearings recently, I believe in Missouri and Michigan. So I'm not 100% sure on the specific legislation that you're speaking about, but there is a lot in the works right now.
Nice. All right. I believe there's also some other things we wrote on another slide. Let me see if I can get that going. Okay, Sierra?
Yeah, so some more successful interventions are to integrate LGBTQI+ tailored materials into existing interventions and wellness programs. So oftentimes LGBTQ people are left out of imagery, including people of color as well. So a lot of times we don't see representation in the materials that are presented. So integrating more diverse people into the ads, such as the ones that we posted on this slide, showing different types of family, showing communities of color, and just letting them know that there are support systems specifically tailored for them to help them quit and prevent them from beginning.
Yeah, and as Sierra said, including those type of peoples of color and people of African American heritage, those people tend to have been marginalized by our society, and unmarginalizing, including them, can make a very big step before they start using unhealthy coping mechanisms like we talked about with vaping and tobacco use. And Sierra, I'll hit up the next slide here.
Yeah, and to go off the point that you just made, Justin, I think it's really important that, certain services aren't necessarily as readily available to these two communities as well. So mental health services, seeing therapists that are inclusive to sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation, or not finding a therapist that knows how to speak to people in the Black community. So that misrepresentation that is often lacking also gives space to not having these proper coping mechanisms.
Yeah, so I want to discuss a little bit of the resources we used when creating this presentation. One is African American leadership groups, Smoking with the Enemy by V.B. Yerker and R.E. Malone. I used a lot of information from this specific journal article on the history of how African Americans were actually tied into this net of menthol cigarettes and tobacco advertising, where it was seen in their daily lives. It's quite a great article, and I would suggest a read. Also, the Truth Initiative and the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids have some great articles regarding this content, including tobacco use in the Black Americans, tobacco use in the African American community, and tracing the racist tactics of the tobacco industry.
Yeah, and I used a lot of the content from the LGBT Cancer Network. So I don't think their website ended up on here, but I'll type it in the chat so you can all check out their website. There's a ton of really helpful resources. They do deal a lot with the LGBT community, cancer, smoking, really anything that is a health impact for that community. So it's a great resource. And although we're on the East Coast, it doesn't only apply to where we are. So, and then the top link is a link to the PATH study that I referenced earlier on. So it goes over some additional statistics in youth vaping and initiation.
Nice. All right. Sierra, can you think of anything else in our presentation that was left off before we go to questions?
No, I think we're ready to move on towards discussion and questions. And we'll just kick it off with if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or also unmute yourself. I love to hear people's voices and see your faces if you're comfortable turning on your video. If not, that's totally fine as well.
And also right there at the Ask Question you can put a question and it will actually appear, I think, on this slide.
And there was a few questions that rolled through the chat. I know Michelle mostly answered those for us. Thank you for doing that while we were speaking. If there's any that we want to read out and then maybe go over the answers, I think an important one that Michelle answered was, the question was, why is increased taxes on tobacco products considered better? Do the minority communities specifically benefit from this? And I think that's a really good question. So as Michelle said, it's not that the tobacco taxes are necessarily better, but increasing taxes on tobacco products has been proven to increase cessation. And as Michelle said, I'm just kind of reading through the chat, so in case someone didn't read, it can be difficult to enact bans because many states have preemption around tobacco product regulation, and the tobacco companies challenge the bans all the time. There was a court case, and I don't remember the exact names of the people, so I won't reference that, but it was quite a few years ago, and the FDA basically, they wanted to implement this imagery that would be put into cigarette packs. And it was not anything more than other countries have implemented. So, pictures of lungs that are ill, pictures of teeth that have rotted, we all know Terry from the Truth Initiative with her tracheostomy. So they wanted to put this imagery into cigarette packs, and the big tobacco company was like, absolutely not. So they said that they couldn't use those graphic warnings because that type of health condition doesn't happen to everyone who smokes. So they felt like it was not accurate education, which is really interesting because we do know that these health risks happen from smoking. It's well documented. But and the FDA was not able to use those graphic warnings. So it's not as easy to pass legislation as we think that it should be. So sometimes doing things more on a community level, like raising the taxes, which is up to the states to do. So states have more control over something like that versus putting a regulation on the tobacco company.
So I'm not seeing any questions on the Google slide, so I'm going to stop the screen share real quick.
That's interesting. Michelle just put in the chat that the FDA has allowed them to delay using the labels. Also in other countries where they have graphic warnings, you can purchase a sleeve to cover the pictures. So it's kind of like, catch-22, because every time you make something, other people are out there to make something that totally reverses that. So I think it's really interesting that people actually pay money to buy a sleeve to cover the pictures. Yeah, and Europe has those pictures. I know that Thailand has graphic warnings, and some of them are pretty intense, but not in the US. They said that the Supreme Court said that that's not okay. Does anyone have any questions, or were you surprised by anything that was in our presentation, or would you like us to elaborate on anything else? So a question in the chat. Could you speak into the messages it would send for all tobacco advocated at non-LGBTQI+ white people? So it's not to say that tobacco is only advertising to communities of color or only advertising to LGBTQ people. There is this advertising everywhere. It's really pervasive, and it is getting into really everywhere in every community. So I think that what I mentioned earlier is like having a community initiative. So if there's a corner store by your house that is plastered in tobacco advertising, come together with your community and ask them to sign a petition and ask them to take it down and change the advertising to something else. So I think that is some things that we can do to intervene in the targeted ads. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question. Please feel free to ask a follow-up.
Can I jump on the mic? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead,
please.
Actually, let me put the video on too, just because I will have to soon anyway. I was just wondering what messages it would send for all of the advertising to be directed at a specific demographic, because then it might seem to that demographic, people probably who look like me, that we are the ones who smoke, or it could feel a little bit different for other communities to not be represented in a large part of media. And I'm obviously not saying that it's healthy to smoke. I don't want to see anybody smoking. I wish there were no tobacco advertising whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm curious, since you guys are the experts, what messages that would send.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I don't know, Justin, do you feel like you have a good answer for this one?
So most of our presentation was actually outlining how we have this disproportionate marketing to LGBTQ+ and African Americans for certain products, that it becomes part of the culture. And I actually think your idea of what would happen if it was only a certain demographic being targeted, well, we might have ideas of exclusion. That's quite a possible idea, that there could be people seeing outside of this marketing. But also, I think the same reaction that we're seeing from the Truth Initiative and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids would also occur, is that we have this disproportionate marketing going to a certain community, encouraging that community to be embedded in the culture. And I think if they actually ended up targeting it down to one specific demographic, one person, one nationality, that now not only would it become part of their culture, but it might even become part of the popular culture, where each individual from others, Black, LGBTQ, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, they could all actually see that advertising and maybe even think that as a stereotype. I think that is quite a possibility. Sarah, anything else to add?
No, I think that is a good answer.
All right, are there any other questions?
So much, Justin, and thank you, Sierra. I really appreciate you sharing everything that you did today. It was really excellent presentation that was really nicely put together and terrifying. And so thank you for taking the time to participate today, and I hope that you will continue to be a part of the symposium in years to come.